Was Brian Laundrie a threat to Gabby Petito? Was there a likelihood of continuing domestic violence between Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie? And what did the investigator find when he investigated the domestic violence incident, the traffic stop between Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie in August of 2021 in Moab, weeks before her tragic death? So I read that investigator's report, and I have 21 surprising things to tell you, and I'm sure you will find many more. So I'm going to put a link to the investigator's report so you can read it for yourself. You can make your own analysis. So I want to thank you for subscribing to my channel. Please support my work by subscribing, hit that like button, share these videos, and leave a comment or question, because I want to know what your analysis is, because this is simply my analysis. Okay, so let me give you a little context here. So this investigator report came out in January. This investigator, who's a police officer, a captain in one of the adjacent jurisdictions, he's the one that investigated this incident. How did the officers handle this incident? He looked at the video, the body cam footage that we all watched, that appalling footage of the incident between Gabby and Brian when they were interviewed by the police officers. This investigator also interviewed those officers who were on the scene, the two officers, and made some conclusions and some findings. Okay, so number one, the finding that the investigator made was that these officers made several unintentional mistakes, which I think is quite interesting wording, because are mistakes ever intentional? Number two, the investigator found that the officers had probable cause to arrest Gabby Petito for assault, not Brian Laundrie. I thought that was rather interesting, and I'll tell you why. We'll get to it. Number three, when the officers were interviewed by the investigators, one officer said that he did not believe that this situation escalated to domestic violence assault as much as a mental health crisis. That officer was the officer who spoke to Brian. He's the one that you saw on the video speaking to Brian. He thought it was a mental health crisis that they were having. The other officer, who, by the way, had 16 years in law enforcement, he was the field training officer, the officer who made the comment about the mental health crisis or the assessment of a mental health crisis, didn't see it as an escalation of domestic violence. He was a trainee. That officer who was talking to Brian was a trainee. The other officer was the field training officer supervising. That officer had 16 years of law enforcement experience. And his assessment of what happened was that it was an emotional or a mental health crisis, but not an assault. I'm sorry, it was an emotional or mental health break and not an assault. That's what a 16-year experienced officer concluded. It was called in as a domestic dispute. Number five, no arrest was made of either Gabby or Brian because the officers concluded, both officers concluded, that there was a missing element of an assault. They found that Gabby had no intent to injure Brian. Intent is not an element of an assault. These officers made a mistake, and therefore they didn't arrest Gabby Petito for assault. The officers didn't need to find that Gabby intended. They asked Gabby if she intended to injure Brian. She said no, so therefore they didn't arrest her. The problem is that's not what an assault is. An assault is an act that causes bodily injury. doesn't require the actor to intend to cause injury. Therefore, Gabby and no one was arrested. The officers made a mistake. Training issue? We'll have to find out. Number 6. The officers never contacted the reporting party, the 911 caller who called in to say that a gentleman was slapping a girl at the Moonlight Co-op in that parking lot. The 911 called in, even though the officers were given the phone number of the 911 caller. They never called the 911 caller to get a statement. To this day, they made their determination that Gabby assaulted Brian without contacting the 911 caller, the reporting party. Why didn't they call the reporting party? Why haven't they called? Because the officer explained to the investigator that it wouldn't have changed their determination, their decision, I guess, that Gabby assaulted Brian. That's interesting. They wouldn't have changed their mind had they contacted the 911 caller. Number 7, the officer characterized the injury on Gabby's cheek to be a scuff on her face. A scuff on her face. The investigator found that the officers never asked Gabby or Brian how she got that injury on her cheek. Now keep in mind, both Brian and Gabby had injuries. But Gabby was the one that they found assaulted Brian. Number 8, they took photos of Brian's injuries. They took photos of Gabby and Brian's driver's license. And there was a photo taken by the 911 caller of the license when he saw the gentleman slapping the girl, them getting into the van and driving off. But guess what? Those photos are missing, or they were not uploaded with the incident report. So the investigator was not given photos that the officers took of injuries on Brian's arm, injuries on his neck, and there were no photographs taken of the injury on Gabby's face. Number 9, and this will probably surprise you even more. Number 9, they classified this incident as disorderly conduct. Even though Moab refers to it as a domestic violence incident, the officer filed a report. His incident report classified this as a disorderly conduct, not a domestic violence incident. It was called in by the 911 caller. It was told by dispatch. The officers were told it was a domestic dispute. Yet the report that was filed characterized it as disorderly conduct. Number 10, the report review policy at the Moab Police Department requires that the field training officer review the report and that the supervisor also review the incident report. Well, it was reviewed by Officer Pratt, who was the field training officer. He reviewed Officer Robbins' incident report, characterizing this as disorderly conduct. And the supervisor, the assistant chief, also reviewed Officer Robbins' disorderly conduct incident report. And they never changed the characterization of the incident to a domestic violence incident. It was filed as a disorderly conduct incident. The supervisor, the field training officer, never required or corrected Officer Robbins, who was in training, to indicate that it was a domestic violence incident. The supervisor did, according to Officer Robbins, request that he change some wording in the report, but they didn't change the report from a disorderly conduct incident to a domestic violence incident. Number 11, the incident report was never forwarded to a prosecuting attorney. In Utah, it's required by law on domestic violence incidents to forward the incident report to the prosecuting attorney within 5 days. They never referred this domestic violence incident report to the prosecuting attorney, probably because it was characterized as a disorderly conduct report. Disorderly conduct incident. So they never forwarded a domestic violence incident report to the prosecuting attorney. Number 12, the officers described Gabby's conduct at the scene. One of the officers said she was in manic state. She was confused and emotional. She was in a panicked state. She was not fully coherent. Gee, are any of those red flags in a domestic violence incident? Number 13, the officer, in explaining Gabby's slapping Brian, he said that, quote, she wanted equality in the relationship and she didn't have the tools in her toolbox to figure out how to do that. I kid you not. She wanted equality in her relationship. She didn't have the tools in her toolbox to figure out how to do that. This was a domestic violence incident. She didn't have the tools in her toolbox. They didn't see Gabby. They didn't see that this was a domestic violence incident. They were focused on, Brian saying that she hit her, that she hit him. They were talking about gender, they're supposed to apply the law equally to men and women. I think they got all confused. I think this was a training issue. They didn't see the red flags of classic flags of a victim of domestic violence being confused, being emotional, being panicked, maybe being manic. Not to mention, you can have mental health issues and still be involved in a domestic violence incident and still be a domestic violence victim. She wanted equality. That officer also found that Brian was an emotional threat, but not a physical threat. He was a mental threat. He was an emotional threat, but not a physical threat to Gabby. That's what the officer concluded. Number 14, that same officer concluded that no one reported that Brian struck Gabby. He wrote it in his report. No one reported that Brian struck Gabby. Well, that's not true. The 911 caller reported it was a domestic dispute. A gentleman was slapping a girl. Number 15, Brian admitted to pushing Gabby when she was trying to get the keys to the van. He admitted to pushing her. Why did she want the keys to the van? 16, Brian said he didn't want Gabby to leave because he didn't have a phone. That's how he explained why he pushed Gabby away, didn't want her to get into the van, locked up the van, put her backpack on the bumper, didn't want her to have access to the van because he didn't want her to leave because he didn't have a phone. That's what he told the officers. But if you look at the video cam and if you look at what's noted in the investigator's report, Brian did have his phone. He looked at it when he gave the officers his phone number at the scene. Brian lied to the officers. But that was his justification for not letting Gabby into the van. And why he admitted to pushing her is because he didn't have a phone. He lied about that. He had a phone. So why did he push her? Why didn't he let her in the van? 17. A supplemental report that an officer made after the North Point Police Department contacted Moab Police Department. This officer was looking for his supplemental report to the incident report. He didn't find it, so he wrote up another supplemental report. This would have been back in September, October. That supplemental report was deleted. Number 18. The officers asked Brian whether or not he wanted to press charges against Gabby at the scene. I think in Utah, you're not supposed to be asking a victim, if they think Brian was the victim here, and maybe he was, if Brian was the victim, you're not supposed to be asking victims whether or not to press charges. I think that's against Utah state law. And I'll ask every officer out there to stop asking victims whether or not they want to press charges, because that shows us how you have no understanding, in my opinion, of domestic violence. Because if a victim is asked to press charges, he or she is usually going to say no. Why? Because they don't want to have to deal with the wrath and further violence when they get blamed because their boyfriend, girlfriend, or partner got arrested for domestic violence. Do you understand the cycle of domestic violence? The cycle of power and control. And when you ask a victim, and please stop asking victims whether or not they want to press charges. Number 19. The investigator had to assess whether there was a likelihood of continuing domestic violence. Did the officers have information at the time that they were talking to Brian and Gabby that there was a likelihood of continuing domestic violence, which I'm sure is a very important factor in the wrongful death claim that Gabby's parents have filed against the Moab City and the Moab Police Department. This investigator in his report concluded that there was no evidence, no prior complaints of domestic violence, nor was Gabby or Brian asked of any prior domestic violence. Now, how can you conclude that there was no evidence if neither Brian or Gabby were asked about prior acts of domestic violence? And by the way, both Gabby and Brian told these officers, and if you read the investigators' the investigators' interviews with Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins, both Brian and Gabby told them, and specifically Officer Robbins' report, that they had prior fights. And that Officer Robbins actually said that, he had difficulty distinguishing whether they were talking about what just happened at the Moonlight Co-op parking lot, where the gentleman was seen slapping a girl, or whether it was relating to fights they had before, weeks before, or whatever. But yet this investigator concludes that there was no evidence of a likelihood of continuing domestic violence. Number 20. The Moab Police Department's I'll show you this to you. Let me show you this to you. I think I have it. Yeah, let's take a look here. Let me look at Officer Robbins' statement here. Let me just show you. Okay. Right here, number 23. As far as the act of how the scratches happened on Brian and how he stated that she was swung and Brian was pushing her away and she'd been off balance at all things. Too, I haven't heard. I got the injury. I got the injuries are there. They were swinging or whatever. But as far as their story of how it happened, I haven't been able to see that. So this is he was asked by the investigator, the Officer Robbins. Officer Robbins said, I was trying to piece it together because their stories were all over the place. They weren't exactly this event happened, that event happened, this event happened, that event happened. It was that this event happened, and then 20 minutes later, that event happened, and then 3 days ago, this event happened. right there is showing that this officer was told by Gabby and Brian that they had had other incidents of domestic violence, other fights. Was that evidence of a likelihood of continuing violence? I think it was. So let's also take a look at something else I wanted to show you in the findings regarding the Moabs. Let me get to it here. I think it's on page Moab City's domestic violence policy. Look at 311.2. Moab City Police Department's response to the incidents of domestic violence and violations relating to court orders shall stress enforcement of the law to protect the victim and shall communicate the philosophy that domestic violence is criminal behavior. Are you kidding me? The philosophy? The philosophy that domestic violence is criminal behavior. Is it a philosophy that theft is a crime? Is it a philosophy that murder is a crime? Is it a philosophy that fraud is a crime? But I guess it's a philosophy that domestic violence is criminal behavior. It's not a philosophy. Domestic violence is a crime. Okay, and here's the last thing that I want to say. If you read this investigator's report, and again, I encourage you to read it. This is number 21. Nowhere in that investigator's report or in the statements that he received, the interview that he did of both officers, nowhere in that investigator's report, and keep in mind that investigator was to determine whether things were done appropriately during this domestic violence call, this domestic violence incident between Gabby and Brian, whether it was investigated properly. That's what this investigator was asked to do. Nowhere in this investigator's report did this investigator ask, what kind of training in domestic violence did these officers have? What kind of experience did these officers have in domestic violence? How many domestic violence calls did they have? What were the red flags of domestic violence? What did they know about domestic violence? What training did they receive in domestic violence? Those questions were never asked by this investigator of these officers. And yet, this officer concludes that Gabby Petito should have been arrested for assault. Again, this is just my opinion, and there's plenty more, and I think if you read that investigator's report, and if you want me to go through it, I will, but it'll be a long video. So, please do leave your analysis. I want to know what you think. Please do leave a comment or a question. Please hit that like button. Please support this channel and my work by subscribing. Please do give me the thumbs up. Share this video, hit the bell notification, and if you want to contribute to me making these videos, I'll put a PayPal link in the description box below the video. And thank you again to all of those of you who have subscribed to my channel, supported my work. I truly appreciate it. And again, I encourage you to read this investigator's report. Do you agree with what his finding is, that there was probable cause to arrest Gabby Petito? It's a terrible, terrible tragedy, and I have no doubt that the mistakes were made because of training issues. But one of those officers had 16 years of experience, and he didn't see it as a domestic violence call. He didn't see Gabby Petito as a victim of domestic violence. I encourage you to read his statement. It's Officer Pratt's statement. He was the field training officer. Officer Robbins was the investigating officer. I encourage you to read it because there's a lot we can learn And I ask that all officers out there to stop asking victims whether or not they want to press charges. And please do get the training so that when you do get a call for a domestic dispute, that you see it as a domestic violence and you see who the victim is and you see who the potential perpetrator is, so that we don't have a tragedy like this to happen again. Because if you've received any training in domestic violence, you know the strong likelihood of the violence escalating and the possibility of one or both being killed in a domestic violence relationship. So again, I send my condolences to to both families. Both of them lost their children. It's a terrible tragedy. And I hope that we learn from this investigator's report. And I hope that radical changes are made in Moab, in the Moab City Police Department, so that this never happens again. And an officer never calls a domestic violence incident a disorderly conduct incident. So thank you very much for watching. I look forward to your comments and your analysis. And please do hit that subscribe button. Thanks again for watching.